On the evening of January 28, 2026, a silence settled over the Huntsville unit that had been decades in the making. At exactly 6:50 p.m., Charles Victor Thompson was pronounced dead, bringing an end to one of the most extraordinary and controversial journeys ever seen on American death row. For nearly 3 decades, his case had moved through courtrooms, appeals, and endless legal battles, stretching far beyond what anyone could have imagined when it first began. But this story was never just about an execution. It was about a man who once accomplished what almost no condemned inmate had ever done. He escaped, not from a sentence, not from a ruling. He escaped from custody itself, walking away from a jail after being sentenced to die and vanishing into the night. For a brief moment, it appeared that the state of Texas might never see him again. Yet time has a way of catching up with every unfinished chapter. The years passed, the appeals continued, the hope of avoiding that final date slowly disappeared. And when January 28th finally arrived, there were no more delays left to grant and no more places left to run. What unfolded during those final hours, what Thompson said before the execution began, how the victims' families reacted, and what witnesses observed inside that chamber is a story that still leaves difficult questions behind. And that is exactly where we begin. January 28, 2026 arrived with the kind of quiet that often surrounds the most irreversible moments. Inside the Huntsville unit in Texas, Charles Victor Thompson woke up knowing that every hour ahead carried a weight unlike any other day of his life. The routines of the prison continued as they always had. Doors opened, officers moved through hallways, paperwork changed hands. Yet everyone involved understood that this day was different. By nightfall, a chapter that had stretched across nearly 3 decades was expected to come to an end. Thompson was 55 years old. He had spent years living under a sentence that had shaped every part of his future. For more than 2 decades, his case had moved through courts, appeals, hearings, and legal reviews. Each filing represented another attempt to challenge the outcome that had followed him since the late 1990s. Some efforts gained attention. Others disappeared into legal records. But all of them shared the same purpose: to prevent the date that was now sitting directly in front of him. Earlier that week, one of the final opportunities available to him had already slipped away. His request for clemency had been denied, removing a path that rarely succeeds but remains one of the last hopes for many condemned inmates. That decision placed even greater importance on the emergency legal arguments his attorneys continued to pursue. As the morning unfolded, filings were still being reviewed and judges were still being asked to intervene. The possibility of a delay remained alive, even if only by the narrowest margin. What made the situation remarkable was how much of Thompson's life had already been defined by second chances. Years earlier, legal issues surrounding his original sentence had forced the courts to revisit key parts of the case. A new sentencing proceeding followed, giving him another opportunity to avoid the outcome that prosecutors continued to seek. Yet when that process concluded, the result remained unchanged. The death sentence stood. And as the hours of January 28th continued to pass, Thompson found himself facing a reality that had survived every challenge placed in front of it. The legal fight was still moving forward, but time was moving faster. If there is one reason the name Charles Victor Thompson continues to stand apart from nearly every other death row case in modern America, it is because there was a time when the state nearly lost him forever. Long before January 28, 2026 arrived, Thompson had already done something that most people believed was impossible for a condemned inmate. He escaped. The story sounds almost unbelievable even years later. Following a resentencing proceeding in 2005, Thompson was being held inside the Harris County Jail in Houston while the legal process continued. He was no ordinary prisoner. He was a man who had once received a death sentence and had once again been ordered to die. Security around inmates in that position is expected to be among the strictest in the system. Yet despite those safeguards, Thompson managed to exploit a weakness that few people saw coming. Using a carefully planned deception involving inmate identification, he succeeded in leaving the facility and walking out into the outside world. For a brief period, he became one of the most wanted fugitives in the country. Law enforcement agencies immediately launched a search, aware that every passing hour increased the possibility that he might disappear permanently. News of the escape spread quickly because nothing like it had happened in modern death row history. For 3 days, uncertainty replaced certainty. Investigators followed leads. Officers tracked possible movements across state lines. Meanwhile, Thompson continued moving away from Texas. Reports later indicated that he was attempting to secure money that could help him continue his flight. Some investigators believed he hoped to reach another country and begin a life beyond the reach of the legal system that had condemned him. But the freedom lasted only a matter of days. Authorities eventually located him in Louisiana and brought the escape to an end. The capture returned him to the prison system and restored the reality he had worked so hard to avoid. From that moment forward, there would be no more physical escapes. No more attempts to outrun the sentence through distance. The courtroom became his final battlefield. Years turned into decades as attorneys continued filing motions and appeals. Judges reviewed arguments. Courts issued decisions. Yet every legal road eventually led back to the same destination. And on January 28, 2026, with the execution date only hours away, Thompson was once again waiting to learn whether another court would intervene or whether the path ahead had finally reached its end. By late afternoon on January 28, 2026, the uncertainty that had followed Charles Victor Thompson throughout the day was beginning to disappear. The final legal efforts had reached their conclusion. The courts had spoken. The requests for intervention had been denied. After years of motions, hearings, appeals, and reviews, there were no additional rulings left to wait for. The answer had finally arrived. Inside the Huntsville unit, the routine shifted as it always does when an execution is approaching. Thompson was moved closer to the execution chamber, a step that carries a significance understood by everyone involved. It marks the point where legal possibilities give way to procedure. For the inmate, for the staff, and for the witnesses who will later enter the observation rooms, it signals that the final stage has begun. During those last hours, visits were permitted. Conversations took place that would never happen again. Family members faced the painful reality that every word carried unusual importance. Moments that might seem ordinary on any other day suddenly became permanent memories. Witnesses later described an atmosphere filled with emotion, reflection, and sorrow. The legal arguments that had dominated the case for years were no longer the focus. Attention had shifted toward family, faith, and the people who would remain behind. As evening approached, Thompson was escorted into the execution chamber. Witnesses gathered behind the glass. Representatives connected to both the inmate and the victims' families took their places. A spiritual advisor stood nearby and offered a prayer before the procedure began. The room itself remained quiet, clinical, and controlled, yet the significance of the moment extended far beyond its walls. When Thompson delivered his final statement, he spoke directly to the victims' families and expressed regret for the events that had brought everyone to that room. He also addressed his own children, offering words of love and faith during the final moments of his life. Those statements became the last public record of a man whose case had traveled through nearly 3 decades of legal history. Soon afterward, the execution process began. Witnesses observed as the room grew silent and the procedure moved forward. Minutes later, Charles Victor Thompson was pronounced dead at 6:50 p.m. on January 28, 2026. The long legal journey was over. The man who had once escaped custody, challenged his sentence through countless appeals, and spent years awaiting his fate had reached the final page of his story. When the witnesses eventually stepped outside the Huntsville unit on the evening of January 28, 2026, the procedure was over, but the emotions surrounding it were not. Cases like this rarely end the moment a death is pronounced. They continue in memories, in unanswered questions, and in the lives of the people who spent years waiting for that final outcome to arrive. For the families connected to the victims, the road to that evening had been measured not in days or months, but in decades. Nearly 28 years had passed since the violence that set everything in motion. During those years, there were trials, appeals, reversals, resentencing proceedings, an escape that stunned the nation, a capture, and countless legal filings. The case moved forward one ruling at a time while families carried the burden of remembering every step. What happened on January 28th represented the legal conclusion to a story that had remained open for most of a generation. Yet, execution cases have a way of raising the same difficult questions every time they reach their ending. Does justice and closure always mean the same thing? Can a sentence carried out decades later truly settle the pain that began years before? And when the headlines disappear, who continues carrying the weight left behind by the original crime? Those questions remain long after the courtroom doors close. Perhaps one of the most striking parts of that final evening was the contrast between how the story began and how it ended. Charles Victor Thompson once became the death row inmate who escaped. For 3 days, he experienced a freedom that few believed possible. He crossed state lines, avoided capture, and appeared determined to leave his sentence behind forever. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the system had lost him. But time continued moving forward. The courts continued working. The years continued passing. Eventually, the date that had been delayed so many times arrived anyway. No more appeals waiting to be filed. No more rulings left to review. No more opportunities to run. Just a quiet evening inside a Texas execution chamber. Final words spoken to loved ones. A prayer offered in the last moments. And a story nearly 3 decades in the making reaching its final page. Whether one views that ending as justice, closure, or something far more complicated, one fact remains unchanged. At 6:50 p.m. on January 28, 2026, a chapter that had shaped countless lives finally came to an end.